saw your eyes getting big. Isn't that great? Those screens are unbelievable. And I never thought I would worship in high def. But we do. Some of you obviously are very aware of Greg Zink, who is in our church, led our students for many years now, and he's assumed every responsibility we've thrown at him. We're getting ready through the science of biology. We are not, but the science of biology is getting ready to throw them a curve in that they're having their second child soon, and we celebrate that for them. I hope you told Heather before I announced that to the congregation that I was going to do that, okay? They have a little one, Eli. Is he 18 months? 2 years. 2 years, going on 12. And he's been hanging out at the office some during the summer, and it's been fun to get to know him and see him at work on Greg's office walls and things in there. I guess I thought of that, and I texted him just before I got up, because the whole theme of this opening is, what are you afraid of? And there are lots of things to be afraid of, and in the context of the scripture that we're going to read, if you want to turn over to Acts 24, we're going to hit that, although it will be on the screen. We're going to talk about matters of faith. What is it that you might be afraid of in terms of matters of faith? If ever a minister was looking for the perfect loaf of bread to slice in Scripture, it would be this, because it just kind of lays wide open and gives you 3 very clear points. Are you afraid of our inability to measure up to the righteousness of God? That's something to be at least concerned about. Are you afraid of a lack of self-control that would allow your life to get some balance to it, some semblance of order? Or are you afraid of the judgment of God? And I suspect at some point everybody has at least a little bit of those. So, Acts 24:22, but Felix, having a more exact knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will decide your case. And then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. But some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Jesus Christ. And here's the punchline. But as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you. At the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often, converse with him. But after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. Just so you know, I oftentimes have very technical worksheets that I work from, and so you're going to see one of my worksheets up there. Isn't that impressive? Well, I had to try to define who Drusilla and Felix was to you. And rather than just read all of that out, I thought, this morning I just shot this to Greg and said, Greg, I'm going to be talking about this, but I'd rather show it. Look at the center mainly, and that is that Drusilla is the second. This is her second marriage. I show you who her first marriage was, Azizus over here. But this is her second marriage, and she, in fact, was kind of married when she got interested in this other guy, Felix. And you'll hear more about the web that they weave. But Felix is the procurator of Judea, and he was appointed by Claudius. And the thing interesting about Felix is he was a slave before so he was raised up in the ranks. Go around the circle, you'll see that Drusilla was the sister to Agrippa II, that she was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. Now we're getting into some tall cotton here. The niece to Herod Antipas, who had this little encounter, you may remember, with John the Baptist, where John the Baptist lost his head. That was him. And then the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. Now, I guess what I want you to know about it is the fact that these are well-connected people. They are people, even if they were born on the other side of the tracks like Felix was as a slave, they were folks who were well-connected. maybe it was that Felix knew how to marry well. At least he tried 3 times, so surely he must have gotten it right eventually. But that's kind of the context out of which we're going to walk today. Paul is in the picture here. He's a convert to Christianity. And so for the last 25 years of Paul's life, he is deeply committed to his faith and now finds himself in prison. He leaves Jerusalem, comes and is arrested, brought to Caesarea as a prisoner, and then that's when Drusilla and them become involved. You have to wonder how much Drusilla and Felix had known because of all the history that surrounds Drusilla's life. She knew about this Christian. They called it the Way. She knew about that because they had been killing some folks. Now, when Rome gets in charge, they really just want peace. And so they just try to do enough in the government to keep peace so that the rulers could do whatever they wanted. And folks still kind of want to do that. They call it exclusion from the church, not just separation of church and state. But verse 24 is the one that verse 25 of chapter 24 is where I landed. Let me read it one more time to you. But as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present, and when I find the time, I will summon you." How many times have you put off something that you needed to take care of? Okay, if you got your folder, want to follow along, why did talk about righteousness cause fear in Felix? Anytime you place God's ideal next to yours, you're going to get a little uneasy, and that was what was going on here. And almost all of the religions, no matter what you come from or where you're, there is a sense that you and I have not, in fact, complied with the expectation that God has placed in my heart and my mind, and so there is this void. Almost every religion known to man feels like there is, in fact, a void that only God. There's a sense of doing right that we all have. Notice here that Paul takes the known and tries to relate it to him. The word he uses here for justice is the word, the word for righteousness is the word that many of the Greek scholars used as justice. So he took a word that was out there in the marketplace and he said, I'll pull that word over here and I'll use that because he's likely to understand that word, and he did that. But Felix's idea of justice and Paul's idea of being right with God was certainly going to clash. So what was going on? If you notice in the verse following that, 26, at the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given to him and that he used to come back and talk with him. So what's going on here? He wants to be bribed. He lives in a system where money talks, and so he has this guy's future in his hands, and so he's thinking, well, if I keep talking, maybe he'll get the idea that maybe a little money would grease my palm enough that we could take care of business here. But he never did, oddly enough. When I think of righteousness, I think of the church, and I gave you the premise of what I'm going to be saying with that verse, and that is the church is not in and of itself righteous. Now, we seek to be like Christ, and we live a righteous life based upon the righteousness of Christ in our lives, but we never fully attain that. We are on a journey with that. But I want the church to be more righteous all the time. Let me give you some good news about the church. I often read a blog by Tom Schultz, and he does research, and he's a kind of big research guy. And he says that that there are some things about the local church that we need to rejoice. And what are those? Well, he says if we can just stop telling everybody what we're against and start telling them what we're for, that really we would clear the way a whole lot easier. And he gives 3 or 4 things that he thinks we need to realize. Still, even with all the falling away from faith that we know in America, still over 70% of the people regularly say they have accepted Christ and that they are Christians. America has over 300,000 local congregations. I wonder what would happen if we connected with every public school in America. There's 100,000. We have 300,000 churches. Wonder what would happen. I don't know too many public schools that are not willing to let a church connect connect with them and help in terms of the after school or the nurturing of them. I mean, we're heavily involved at Latonia Elementary. I was one of the professions that came up there during the day when they talk about different professions. Thirdly, church is the largest volunteer organization in the country, and that we have within our hands, our pocketbooks as churches, over $100 billion. I wonder if just a smidgen of that was shifted more over to touching people with the righteousness of God, getting right with God. I wonder how much of a difference that would make in our world. Secondly, why did talk about self-control cause fear in Felix? Paul begins to talk about self-control. You can imagine a little bit of an embarrassment of Felix and Drusilla, who 2 and 3 marriages into this thing may not have been operating on a lot of self-control. Felix had a problem making decisions. He was indecisive. And I will tell you, of anything that will permeate evil and frustration and damage in your life, it's the inability to make a decision. Sometimes just even making the wrong decision helps you to recognize it sooner and do something about it. But indecision sometimes can be the absolute killer. It was Pope Benedict the 16th who said, "Evil draws its power from indecision and concern with what other people think." And then I pulled one other quote that I thought was interesting. Kitty Muggeridge says, "When self-control or self-denial," she says, "goes out of fashion, self-fulfillment takes its place." Self-control. Do you know the name DeAndre Jordan? I really didn't know DeAndre Jordan all that well. I'd heard of him, but I heard a lot about him this week. I can always promise you one athletic illustration every week, and I usually give you one on sports. Well, DeAndre Jordan said to the Dallas Mavericks, and he's a free agent, that he could play for them next year as their center, and they said, "Yes, we will pay you the maximum salary we can pay you next year." And I know it was going to be difficult for him to live on $80 million for 4 years, but that's what he had promised to commit to. So he promised, but the signing time wasn't until another week or two, and his old team literally came to his door and watched him and sat with him until the time passed for him to sign. So he went back with his original team. Now, what was the value of me talking about that? Well, DeAndre Jordan is a very well-known Christian. Very well-known, very outspoken. One of his tattoos on this side, at least I know, he's got a scripture verse, and he's very spoken about his faith. Matter of fact, let me read you some of the things that he has said about his faith. It's that relationship, that faith, which keeps me grounded, focused, and aware, even when certain things outside of my control don't go my way. Let me just tell you, I don't care which team DeAndre plays for. We don't have a team here, so I don't have a dog in that fight. He can't play for UK next year, so who cares? But as a follower of Christ, it bothers me that he can't make a decision up, and that he can't call the owner of the Mavericks and say, "Hey, listen, dude, I changed my mind, and I hope you understand, but I'm not going to play any games with the other team coming over and blocking my door and making it, It was all over social media. I'm just thinking, no, just stand up, DeAndre, be a big boy, and have a little self-control. Maybe it was all the publicity, but maybe I don't get it. Just tell the man. Thirdly, why did talk about judgment cause fear in Felix? Now, this is probably the easiest one. Whenever you and I begin to think about the judgment of God, whenever we really do get seriously about God's assessment in our lives, then we do experience some level of fear, don't we? At least we ought to. Remember again, now, and you need to remember back to Felix and Drusilla. Felix's second wife, Drusilla, was the daughter of Agrippa, Herod Agrippa I, and the sister of Herod Agrippa II. But she was about 6 years old when her dad died, and so she would still have had a close acquaintance with the history that surrounded the development of Christianity. So here it is that she remembers back that her father's already executed one Christian. His name was James, the brother of John. And then there was an imprisonment he had made possible for another one of those guys named Peter. So the story thickens here. And as I was reading this, and as I was reading my newspaper, as I'm often likely to do, the sentence that came out of my brain conscience awakened does not mean a will surrendered. How many times are our consciences awakened, but we do not surrender our will to it? How do you spell the name Bill Cosby? Because that certainly is the case. I'm not going to give you much more that you have already heard, but I shared with my family. We got to see Nicholas this week and Stacy up in Boston, and as that came across the screen, I like to watch television muted just so if I can see the headlines once in a while. I was sitting there working on some stuff, and I looked across, saw the headline, and went, "You've got to be kidding me." How many times have you said in the last 10 years, "Well, I thought I'd never live long enough to see that"? Well, this is one of those moments. I never thought. Now, most of you know the story. I'll give you just a skeleton, but he's literally been called America's father. He's a comedian, actor, musician, author, began his career in show business about 50 plus years ago. From about 1984 to about 1982, he was, in fact, the star of The Cosby Show, and that show was, for 5 years, was the #1 show in America. He was known for his homespun wisdom and just generally his support of family values. His wife had been married 51 years. But in July of 1997, Cosby was testified in that he paid private payments to a woman for whom he had an affair in the early 1970s. So in recent years, the allegations have been building up kind of underneath, but he always denied everything, and over 40 women now have come forth and said that between the years of 1965 and 2008, that they believe like he gave them drugs and raped them. Now the actor's back in the news now because his deposition from that earlier lawsuit has now been made public. Now, all that's just the background of what I was amazed about was why the judge decided to make this public. I guess I was amazed on two levels. Why Cosby's lawyers said they didn't want it public. Do you know what the reason they said we don't want it public? Well, it would embarrass him. Are you kidding? Embarrassment's a concern at this point? But the judge said this, and I thought it was really interesting. He said the case is not about the defendant's status as a public person by virtue of the exercise of his trade as a televised or comedic personality. Rather, defendant has donned the mantle of public moralist and mounted the proverbial electronic or print soapbox to volunteer his views on, among other things, child rearing, family life, education, and crime. And what the judge finally made the decision on was this. He said, therefore, he has voluntarily narrowed the zone of privacy that he is entitled to claim. Now, what does that mean? That means when you get up on a soapbox, you better be able to stand on the soapbox. When you get up on a stage and a pulpit and anywhere else and you stand on that, you better be able to stand on that. What you say and what you do matters. It was St. Augustine who said, wrong is wrong even if everybody's doing it. And right is right even if nobody is doing it. I have to address that. I hope that doesn't bother you. It would bother me if I did not say something about, in the judgment of God, how those things fit together. You can take away a person's wealth and they'll survive. You can take away a person's health and they will survive. You can take away a person's purpose even. Ask Viktor Frankl that. He has a whole story about that. And he says that they still will make it through. But if you take away, what's the factor that the one thing you cannot take away and a person maintain, and that is the word hope. When you take away a person's hope, they go. Martin Luther King Sr. said, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. What was going on that made Drusilla and Felix give up hope? Because as best we know, they never moved forward. Something about that, maybe it was all a charade based upon profit. But what made them give up hope? We go back to that verse that we began communion with. He made him who knew no sin to be punishments they used to give folks in Romans times? They would compel a captive, and one of the punishments would be they would attach a body to the front of them, and they would make them walk around with that dead body attached to their body. Now imagine that. Virgil described that punishment. He said, the living and the dead at his command were coupled face to face and hand to hand, till choked with stench and loathed embraces tied, the lingering wretches pined away and died. The image of that, which is grotesque, is also profound, because when you think about it, unless the work of Christ is real in our lives, and we sing about it over and over again today, unless the work of Christ is real in our life, we've attached ourselves to a dead corpse. Look into the life of Mr. Cosby. He is dead and did not know it, because he attached himself to death. But we've attached ourselves to life. He's attached himself to hopelessness. We've attached ourselves to hopefulness. Thanks be to God. Let's pray together. Father, it has been good to be in this place and to sense your presence, but more than all that, to know that in leaning into your presence, we lean into your power, we lean into your hope, we lean into your grace. So be with us as we share these moments, Father, when we can, in fact, align our lives with your righteousness, with your goodness, with your grace, with your ability to help us to be recipients of a goodness that will not allow us to lose our hope. Hear our prayer, Father. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. If you're here and you have some business with God, and you need to help, for me to help walk you through that, whether it's a profession of faith, a rededication of your life, or a prayer concern, be a part of this fellowship, whatever it might be, I'll be down in the front if you need me. Let's stand together.